Hey guys, it's Dr. Childs here, and today I want to talk to you about 6 problems with natural desiccated thyroid hormone, or otherwise known as NDT medication. And before I get in here, I want to just say that I'm not against the use of this medication. In fact, I use it fairly frequently among my patients, and so I don't want you to think that I'm against it in any way. However, if you are thinking about using it, or perhaps if you are already using it, there are some things that you should be aware of, and there are potential downsides to using this particular medication, or should I say class of medications, because the information I'm going to be talking about to you today applies to all formulations of NDT. That includes Armour, NP, WP, Natural Desiccated, Thyrolar, etc. There's a lot of different types. I'm not going to name them all, but this information is generic to this entire class. So let's jump in here, number 1, and I have 6 total, so we'll talk about these, I'll list them, and then I'll go into a little more detail of each. So number 1, the formula keeps changing, and there may be shortages over time. So this is important. It may not sound like it, and this isn't unique to just NDT medication. I want to say that first off. This can happen to any type of medication, any pharmaceutical medication, but it doesn't just, and it can happen within different classes of thyroid medications like Synthroid or levothyroxine and so on. The difference is it seems to affect those people on NDT more because it seems to happen to this class of medication more frequently. And what I'm referring to is just slight changes to the inactive ingredients inside of the NDT formulation. And so there's a lot of examples here. I'll just talk about one in general. But back in 2009, Armour Thyroid's formula slightly changed, which included more cellulose. And this caused a big reaction for a lot of people. What it did is it reduced the absorption of the medication, and it potentially caused some GI-related issues. And so even slight changes to these inactive ingredients can have a huge impact on how people tolerate these medications. So I have a little study here. This comes from Armour Thyroid's insert, but it says basically how the medication is formulated can impact how much is absorbed. And so there's a sentence here that says only 41% is absorbed when given in a gelatin capsule, as opposed to 74% absorption when given with an albumin carrier. So there's a big difference in how your medication can be absorbed in your body based off of these inactive fillers or binders that exist inside the medication. And slight changes may not affect everyone, but there could be 20% of the population using NDT that slight change impacts them more than the other people. So you just have to keep this in mind. And for some reason, it tends to happen more with NDT medications, probably just due to cost and things like this, because it's a unique in how it's formulated compared to other pharmaceutical medications. But definitely keep that in mind. I have more information here that can that elaborates on some of those instances where it was changed. Number 2 is it isn't always easy to get. And so I say here, and I readily admit personally, that many people do better on NDT. There's no question about it. But we also need to be practical about it. And what I mean by that is just because it's great and it can help a lot of people doesn't mean it's easy to get for a lot of people, or that once they get it, they can stay on it. And again, this isn't a reason not to use it, but you just need to be aware if you start taking it and you start feeling better, what happens if the doctor who's giving it to you moves or dies or something like that, or whatever, closes down the practice. It's going to be hard for you to find another person to fulfill that medication prescription. It may seem easy, but it isn't. And so that type of stuff does happen to a lot of people. So just keep that in mind when you start it. Again, not a great reason not to use it, but just something to consider. Number 3, the amount of T4 and T3 in each dose is static, not dynamic. And what I mean by that is there is a set amount of thyroid hormone in each grain of NDT. So the way that it works and the way that NDT is dosed is that each grain contains 38 micrograms of T4 and 9 micrograms of T3, and that's static. So if you give 2 grains, you double that. If you give half a grain, you take half of it. There's no way for you to individually tweak the amount of T4 that's in it or the amount of T3 that's in it. And so you might be asking, well, why is that a problem? So I give a couple of scenarios here. What happens if you find that your free T3 is low and your free T4 is normal to high while taking NDT? We know that free T3 is the most important measure of thyroid function. So there's no way for you to just isolate and increase free T3 without also increasing your T4, because the majority of it is T4, as I stated previously. Another example would be, what if you find that your TSH is suppressed, but both your free T3 and free T4 are low to normal, and you're still feeling symptomatic? Again, another problem there. The more thyroid hormone you take of any type of thyroid medication is going to drop that TSH further. And there are plenty of people that have a low TSH before their free thyroid hormones ever get into that normal optimal range when taking NDT. And then lastly, what happens if you experience heart palpitations or anxiety even on a small dose of NDT? And the reason for this, we'll talk about in a minute, but probably has to do with the amount of T3 that's in it. And so these are big problems, because what I find happen in my practice is that as people get more, as more and more problems develop in their body, this could be hormonal problems, or this could be inflammatory problems, gut-related problems, etc., they deviate or shift away from the normal physiologic requirements that your thyroid pumps out normally. And so what I mean by that is, your thyroid gland is normally, in a healthy person, producing about 20% T3 and 80% T4. Okay, there's several studies, I've linked to them here, you can go and look and confirm that. NDT has about 23% T3 and 77% T4. So these are fairly close. So you might say, well, slightly more T3, and I would agree, than what is considered to be quote-unquote healthy. But the problem is, as people get all those issues that I mentioned before, hormone imbalances, thyroid dysregulation, increase in weight, inflammation, etc., the demand for T3 increases more so than the demand for T4. All right. So what could happen is your demand might be something like 40% T3 and 60% T4. You're never going to get that ratio, because the ratio of T4 to T3 in NDT is static at 23 to 77. So you can't individually tweak these doses of the T4 and T3, and that can cause a problem. So this is why a lot of people might do well on NDT, but they'll never get to that sort of optimal 100% that they're looking for. You can read more about this concept in this area here. Number 4, not everyone responds well to T3. So T3 is the most powerful thyroid hormone that exists, and it's fairly powerful. And what we have happen is a lot of people who take T3, even small doses of it, do experience a number of symptoms. And these symptoms of T3 intolerance include hot flashes, anxiety, panic attacks, heart palpitations, rapid heart rate, or what we would call tachycardia, diarrhea, hair loss, headaches, stomach pain, etc. And people can experience these symptoms on even a small dose, like a quarter grain of NDT, which has, just 2 to 3 micrograms of T3 in it. And everyone has a different sensitivity to this T3. And we know that when we look at the genetics of each person, each individual can convert T4 to T3 at a different rate. So there are plenty of people out there who do just fine converting. If you give them T4, they can convert it, effortlessly to T3 and without any issue. But if you give them extra T3, well, that might be enough to tip them over the scale, and now all of a sudden they're becoming symptomatic because they're just getting too much. Number 5 would be, it may flare up your immune system. This one, I don't think it's talked about quite a bit, but it is important to mention here, and it's more of a theoretical problem because we don't have any studies showing that this has absolutely happened, as far as I can tell, and I've looked in depth for these. But essentially, what can happen is NDT is created using animal, or it's animal source, so it comes from pigs basically, and it's desiccated thyroid gland from a pig. The problem is, pig tissues and enzymes and proteins can cause a reaction inside the human body because they're not exactly the same thing. So you probably know a little bit, or maybe have heard that if you tried to take an organ out of somebody and stick it in your own body, even though it's the same organ, a kidney for a kidney, your body might reject it, and it has to do with these proteins and how your body looks at it. Your immune system looks at it and thinks it's foreign, and therefore it tries to kill it. So when you're ingesting animal-sourced proteins and things like this, which are a part of NDT, your body and immune system might react and try to reject or attack those foreign invaders or foreign proteins. And the medical term for this is called serum sickness, and it's been around for a long time. It's been shown to be associated with certain types of medications and so on. So it's well established. You can look at it there if you'd like. But what I want to say here is that I have personally seen a handful of patients, a very small percent, but it does still happen, that when certain patients have been given NDT, they react with an abrupt rise in their thyroid antibody levels, and they feel terrible. It's like a flare-up as a result, and it coincides directly with starting that NDT. So just be aware of this. I think the rate of this happening is very low, maybe a 1 or 2%, very tiny, but it is, it's a real problem for those people that it tends to occur in. And this might help explain why you reacted in the way that you did if you've ever had this experience before. And then number 6, here's probably one of the most important, and I would say that doctors tend to underdose NDT. So I want to look at this image and then I'll just explain it to you briefly. But basically, the standard recommendation, and this is what all doctors are kind of looking at, is to convert T4 to NDT at a certain rate. And so I've highlighted this one here because this is the one I explained in the article. But basically, if you can convince your doctor to switch you from, let's say, levothyroxine or Synthroid to Armour thyroid, they have to figure out how to dose it because they're not the same, right? NDT contains T4 and T3, and levothyroxine just contains T4. So there's not a perfect way to transition from one to the other because each person's slightly different in how they react. But they do have some basic guidelines. And the guidelines here say that for every 100 micrograms of T4 that you're taking, you should transition to, or it's equal to about 1 grain of NDT, or in this case, Armour thyroid. But again, the grains are all the same, so this applies to all of them. But there's a problem with that, and I do kind of the math here. We know from studies that T3 is roughly about 3 times more potent than T4. So we can actually do the math and find the amount of T4 equivalents in Armour thyroid and compare that to the conversion that I just mentioned here. And so what happens is when you take the 38 micrograms in 1 grain of T4, and then you take the 9 micrograms of T3, and we multiply the 9 times 3 because that's 3 times more powerful. So we get, let's see, where did I put it here? Should be, yeah. Let's see. Okay, so 1 grain of NDT contains about 65 micrograms of T4 equivalents to 100 micrograms of T4. Now you can obviously see the problem there. When this conversion is inherently conservative towards Armour thyroid or NDT, which means that when you transition using this, you're probably not going to feel very well because you're underdosing yourself compared to what you should be taking. And so a lot of doctors follow this conversion chart and they end up providing or giving less thyroid hormone than is necessary to certain patients. And then they use the fact that they don't do well on a lower dose to say, oh, see, I told you, the NDT isn't working for you. Your TSH went up and you have fatigue and you gained weight and so on. But the truth is not that the NDT didn't work, but that you were most likely underdosed as you were transition. So you have to be very, very aware of this transition and how you actually do it. So if you're going to try it, make sure you do it correctly. And that's pretty much it, but there's a lot more information. I do believe that in most cases the pros outweigh the cons, and you can read some of the other benefits to using NDT here. But I at least want to just open your eyes to the fact that NDT isn't a perfect medication. Like any medication, there's pros and cons to it. So if you are on NDT, if you're not feeling well, or if you've experienced any of the problems I mentioned here, let me know. Or if you just have any other questions, let me know in the comments section below. I'll do my best to answer those questions as they come, and otherwise I will plan to see you guys in the next one.